What happened in the Henderson mansion that Tuesday morning would change everything forever. But nobody could have predicted that the woman they humiliated would turn out to be someone who could destroy their entire world with just one phone call. This is the story of Amara, a 38-year-old woman from Ghana who came to America with nothing but a dream and a secret that would shake the foundations of one of New York's most powerful families. The morning started like any other for Amara Osei as she stepped off the bus at the corner of 5th Avenue and 82nd Street, her worn cleaning supplies bag slung over her shoulder and her uniform pressed despite being 3 years old. She had been working as a housekeeper for various wealthy families in Manhattan's Upper East Side for the past 4 years, sending every penny she could back to her village in Ghana, where her elderly mother was slowly dying of a disease that American doctors could cure in weeks, but African hospitals couldn't even properly diagnose. What none of her employers knew, what none of the people who looked down on her with barely concealed disgust could imagine, was that Dr. Amara Osei had once been the youngest neurosurgeon ever to graduate from Johns Hopkins Medical School, and that before tragedy struck her family, she had been on track to become one of the most renowned brain surgeons in the world. The Henderson mansion loomed before her like a monument to excess, its pristine white columns and perfectly manicured gardens a stark contrast to the tiny studio apartment in Queens, where Amara counted every dollar and rationed every meal. She walked up to the service entrance as she had been instructed. Never the front door, always the back, always invisible, always less than human in the eyes of people who had never worked a day for anything they owned. Richard Henderson had inherited his fortune from his father's pharmaceutical empire, a business built on the backs of people like Amara who couldn't afford the medicines they produced. And his wife Victoria was the kind of woman who wore her cruelty like expensive jewelry, always on display, always sharp enough to cut. As Amara entered through the service door, she could hear Victoria's shrill voice echoing from the main living area. And immediately she knew this was going to be one of those days where every moment would be a small torture, where every breath would be measured and found wanting. Victoria Henderson was 42 years old, but had spent so much money trying to look 25 that she had achieved that peculiar wealthy woman appearance of being ageless in the most unnatural way possible. Her face pulled tight by surgeries and her body maintained by personal trainers and nutritionists, while she spent her days finding new ways to make the lives of her staff miserable, because misery was the only thing that seemed to give her any real pleasure anymore. Where is that African woman? Victoria's voice carried through the house like nails on a chalkboard, and Amara felt her shoulders tense as she always did when she heard that particular tone, the one that reduced her to nothing more than her continent of origin, as if being African was somehow a character flaw, rather than a source of the deep pride that had sustained her through 4 years of American indifference and cruelty. She was supposed to be here an hour ago, and I have the mayor's wife coming for lunch. And if this house isn't perfect, I swear I'll make sure she never works in this city again. Amara checked her watch and saw that she was actually 15 minutes early, but she had learned long ago that truth was irrelevant when you were powerless, that facts meant nothing when you had no voice, and that dignity was a luxury she couldn't afford when her mother's life depended on every dollar she could earn in this cold country, where her medical degree might as well have been written in invisible ink. She set down her supplies and began the ritual of making herself even smaller, even more invisible, even more acceptable to people who would never see her as anything more than a convenient appliance for cleaning up the messes they made with their careless, wasteful lives. The first task was always the same: clean Victoria's bedroom and the master bathroom. Spaces so opulent they could have housed 3 families back in Ghana, yet somehow never clean enough for a woman who seemed to find dirt in places that defied the laws of physics. As Amara worked, she could hear Richard Henderson on a business call in his study, his voice booming with the kind of confidence that only came from never having faced a single real consequence for anything in his entire privileged life. He was discussing a pharmaceutical patent, something about keeping generic versions of a crucial medication off the market for another 5 years, and Amara's hands stilled on the expensive Egyptian cotton sheets as she realized he was talking about the exact medication her mother needed. The one that cost $8,000 a month and might as well have been made of gold for all the chance her family had of affording it. But what Richard Henderson didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that Dr. Amara Osei had not only worked on the original research team that developed that medication during her residency, she had actually been the one to identify the key compound that made it so effective, a discovery that had been quietly absorbed into the larger project and attributed to the department head who had never spent a single night in the lab, but whose name appeared first on all the patents. The medication that Richard Henderson was now discussing as if it were simply a commodity to be hoarded and rationed had come from Amara's brilliant mind, from her sleepless nights and her determination to save lives. And now she was cleaning his toilet while he figured out new ways to prevent her own mother from accessing the cure she had helped create. Victoria's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. "African woman, come here immediately! And don't you dare touch anything else with those dirty hands of yours." Amara carefully set down her cleaning cloth and walked toward the living room, her heart already racing because she had learned to read the particular cadence of Victoria's voice, and this tone meant someone was about to be humiliated for sport. When she entered the lavishly decorated space, she saw Victoria standing next to an elegant woman in her 50s, who was clearly the mayor's wife. Both of them looking at Amara with the kind of expression people reserved for something unpleasant they had discovered on the bottom of their shoes. "This is what I have to deal with," Victoria said to her guest, gesturing toward Amara as if she were an object rather than a person. "These people come here from their mud huts and think they can just waltz into our country and expect us to take care of them. Look at her, probably carrying diseases we eliminated decades ago. And yet I'm supposed to let her into my home because I can't find decent American help anymore." The mayor's wife nodded sympathetically, and Amara felt something inside her chest crack a little more. Another small piece of her dignity crumbling away like everything else she had been forced to sacrifice on the altar of survival. But then Victoria continued, and what she said next would be the spark that ignited everything that followed. "I bet she doesn't even speak proper English. Probably got here on some refugee program. And now we're all supposed to pretend she's equal to us, when we all know she'd still be living in a tree if we hadn't colonized her people and taught them how to be civilized." The mayor's wife laughed, actually laughed, as if the systematic destruction of entire cultures was somehow amusing, and Amara felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been carefully contained for 4 long years but was now beginning to strain against its boundaries. Amara had endured 4 years of casual racism, 4 years of being treated as less than human, 4 years of swallowing her pride and her anger and her brilliance because her mother's life was worth more than her dignity. But standing in that moment, listening to these 2 women discuss her as if she were livestock, something inside her finally reached its breaking point. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams, was that Dr. Amara Osei had been fluent in 7 languages by the age of 16, that she had published groundbreaking research in neurosurgery by the age of 25, and that she had given up everything not because she was incapable or inferior, but because love had demanded a sacrifice that no one should ever have to make. "Ma'am," Amara said quietly, her voice steady despite the hurricane building in her chest, "I need to inform you that there seems to be some confusion about my background." Victoria's eyes narrowed with the particular malice of someone who was about to enjoy crushing an insect, and she turned to face Amara with the kind of smile that would have made sharks jealous. "Oh, this should be entertaining," Victoria said to her guest. "The help is about to try to explain herself to us. Please, by all means, educate us about your impressive background." Amara reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, and with the calm precision of someone who had performed thousands of surgical procedures, she dialed a number that would change everything. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered, warm and professional, and completely recognizable to anyone who had ever watched the evening news in New York City. "Dr. Martinez, it's Amara," she said, her voice clear and confident for the first time in 4 years. "I'm at the Henderson residence, and I think it's time." Victoria's face began to change as she realized that the woman she had been tormenting was speaking to someone with obvious familiarity and authority, but she still didn't understand the magnitude of what was about to happen. "Doctor," Elena Martinez was not only the chief of neurosurgery at Mount Sinai Hospital, she was also the woman who had been trying to convince Amara to return to medicine for the past 3 years, ever since she had discovered that one of the most promising surgical residents in the history of Johns Hopkins was cleaning houses in Queens to pay for her mother's medical care. "I'm sorry, but who exactly do you think you're calling?" Victoria demanded, her voice still dripping with contempt but now tinged with the first hint of uncertainty. Amara looked at her with eyes that were no longer those of a powerless housekeeper, but of someone who had just remembered exactly who she was and what she was capable of. "I'm calling the woman who has been offering me the position of chief resident in neurosurgery for the past 6 months," Amara said calmly. "Dr. Martinez, are you still there?" "Yes, I've made my decision. When can I start?" But Amara wasn't finished, because 4 years of suppressed brilliance and dignified silence were about to pour out like water through a broken dam, and nothing was going to stop the flood. "Dr. Martinez, while I have you on the line, I wanted to discuss something else," Amara continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You remember that pharmaceutical research I consulted on last year? The one about the Henderson Industries medication patents?" "Yes. I think it's time we had that conversation with the FDA about the pricing irregularities and the suppression of generic alternatives." Richard Henderson, who had been listening from his study, came running into the living room just in time to hear his family's pharmaceutical empire being casually dismantled by the woman his wife had been treating like garbage for the past 8 months. "What is going on here?" Richard demanded, his face red with confusion and growing alarm. Victoria turned to him with wild eyes, finally beginning to understand that they had not been tormenting a powerless immigrant, but someone who apparently had the connections and knowledge to threaten everything they had built their lives around. "Richard," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible, "I think we may have made a mistake. Not as a convenient target for their racism and classism, not as a faceless member of the help, but as Dr. Amara Osei, former neurosurgical resident, pharmaceutical researcher, and the woman who was about to teach them that actions had consequences even for people who thought they were untouchable." "Mr. Henderson," she said calmly, "I believe you're familiar with patent 4A7B9, the neurological medication your company has been artificially pricing at $8,000 per month. How do you know about that patent?" he whispered. And Amara smiled for the first time in 4 years. Not the careful, apologetic smile of a woman trying to make herself acceptable, but the confident smile of someone who had just remembered she held all the cards. "I know about it because I helped develop it," she said simply. Dr. Amara Osei, Johns Hopkins Medical School, graduated summa cum laude neurosurgical residency at Massachusetts General, pharmaceutical research fellowship at Harvard. "I spent 3 years of my life perfecting that compound, while your company's research team was still trying to figure out why their initial trials kept failing. My research, my sleepless nights, my breakthrough discovery that made your patent possible." The woman she had spent months calling ignorant and uncivilized was not only more educated than she was potentially one of the most brilliant medical minds of her generation. And Victoria had just spent the last hour systematically humiliating her in front of a witness who happened to be married to the mayor of New York City. "But then why?" Victoria stammered. "Why are you here cleaning houses? I gave up everything I had worked for, everything I was, to become invisible enough to survive in your world while I earned the money to keep the most important person in my life breathing for just a little longer." Richard Henderson found himself face to face with the human cost of his business practices, looking at a woman whose brilliance could have contributed immeasurably to medical science, but who had been forced to abandon her calling because he had priced her mother's survival out of reach. Victoria stared at Amara with growing horror as she realized that every cruel word, every casual insult, every moment of deliberate humiliation had been inflicted on someone who had sacrificed everything for love. Someone who had more strength and character in her little finger than Victoria had in her entire surgically enhanced body. But the mayor's wife, who had been standing in shocked silence throughout this revelation, suddenly spoke up with the kind of insight that comes from a lifetime in politics. "Dr. Osei," she said carefully, Are you telling us that Henderson Industries has been deliberately overpricing a medication that you helped develop, and that this pricing scheme has prevented you from being able to afford treatment for your own family member? Amara nodded, and the mayor's wife pulled out her own phone with the practiced efficiency of someone who had just recognized a political opportunity that could define a career. What happened next moved with the lightning speed of modern scandal. The mayor's wife, Margaret Chen, was not just a political spouse but a former investigative journalist who had spent years exposing pharmaceutical company corruption before her marriage temporarily derailed her career. Within minutes, she had confirmed Amara's credentials through her contacts at Johns Hopkins and Massachusetts General, verified her research contributions through academic databases, and connected her with 3 different FDA investigators who had been trying to build a case against Henderson Industries for the past 2 years. Richard Henderson watched his world collapse in real time as Dr. Amara Osei calmly provided Margaret Chen with documentation that had been stored on her phone for the past 4 years. Research notes and correspondence that proved not only her contributions to the medication patent, but also her repeated attempts to contact Henderson Industries about compassionate use programs that had been ignored or actively suppressed. You kept trying to help people even after they forced you out, Margaret observed with growing amazement. You've been documenting everything, and I never stopped believing that someday the truth would matter more than money. She showed them emails she had sent to Richard's company, formal requests for patient assistance programs, detailed proposals for making the medication accessible to people in developing countries, all of which had been dismissed or ignored by executives who saw her as nothing more than a former employee with no power to cause trouble. But they had been wrong about her power, catastrophically wrong, because Dr. Amara Osei had not just been documenting Henderson Industries' practices, she had been building a case that would ultimately expose systematic fraud across the entire pharmaceutical industry. The research she had been conducting during her off hours, between house cleaning jobs, had revealed patterns of patent manipulation, artificial scarcity creation, and price fixing that went far beyond a single medication. She had been preparing for this moment for 4 years, gathering evidence while her employers assumed she was too ignorant and powerless to understand what she was seeing. Margaret Chen's phone began ringing constantly as word spread through political and media circles that a major pharmaceutical scandal was breaking, and that the woman at the center of it was currently standing in a Manhattan mansion, wearing a housekeeper's uniform. Within an hour, there were news crews gathering outside the Henderson residence, and Richard Henderson realized that his family's name was about to become synonymous with corporate greed and racial discrimination on a scale that would destroy everything they had built. Dr. Osei, Margaret said after ending her latest phone call, I have someone here who wants to speak with you. She handed Amara her phone, and on the other end was the voice of Senator Elizabeth Warren, who had been investigating pharmaceutical pricing irregularities as part of a major congressional investigation. Dr. Osei, I understand you have information that could help us save thousands of lives, the senator said without preamble. How quickly can you get to Washington? Mrs. Henderson, Amara said quietly, I want you to understand something. I never wanted revenge. I never wanted to hurt your family. I just wanted to save my mother, and I was willing to endure anything to make that possible. But your cruelty today wasn't about me. It was about something broken inside you that makes you feel bigger when you make other people feel small. Standing in front of Dr. Amara Osei, a woman who had sacrificed a brilliant career for love and had endured years of humiliation with dignity and grace, Victoria finally saw herself clearly, and what she saw was ugly beyond redemption. But Amara wasn't finished, because 4 years of suppressed truth were still pouring out, and she had something else to say that would change everything once again. There's something else you should know, she continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. My mother didn't just need medication, she needed surgery, very specialized surgery that only a handful of doctors in the world are qualified to perform. I spent 4 years earning money to pay for that surgery. 4 years of cleaning houses and enduring insults and swallowing my pride. And last month I finally had enough saved to bring her to New York. Osei, are you telling us that you've been planning to perform surgery on your own mother? Amara shook her head with a small smile that contained more strength than Victoria Henderson had ever possessed. No, Mrs. Chen. I'm telling you that I performed surgery on my mother 3 weeks ago at Mount Sinai Hospital with Dr. Martinez assisting. The surgery was successful, and she's recovering beautifully. Amara had not only endured 4 years of humiliation and sacrifice, she had achieved her goal. Her mother was safe, her mother was alive, and now Dr. Amara Osei was free to reclaim everything she had given up, free to step back into the world where her brilliance belonged, free to stop pretending to be less than she was. The only reason I was still cleaning houses, she continued, was to pay for her recovery and rehabilitation. I was planning to return to medicine next month anyway. Today just moved up my timeline. You saw a black African woman in a cleaning uniform and decided I was worth less than nothing. The fact that I happen to be a doctor doesn't make your behavior any less racist or cruel. It just makes it ironic. This was about the fundamental human tendency to judge people based on appearances, to assign worth based on circumstances, and to miss the extraordinary humanity that exists in every person if you're willing to look past your own prejudices to see it. Mrs. Henderson, Amara said, turning to face Victoria directly, I want you to remember this moment every time you're tempted to judge someone based on their job or their accent or the color of their skin. Because you never know when the person you're dismissing might be the one person who could change your life, or save it, or destroy it completely. Victoria nodded mutely, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the magnitude of her cruelty and the grace with which it had been endured. But Dr. Amara Osei wasn't quite finished, because she had one more revelation that would complete her transformation from victim to victor, from powerless to powerful, from invisible to unforgettable. There's one last thing you should know, she said, and her voice now carried the authority of someone who had remembered not just who she was, but who she was going to become. The congressional testimony I'm going to give next week won't just be about Henderson Industries. It's going to be about a systematic reform of pharmaceutical pricing that could save millions of lives and billions of dollars. The research I've been conducting for the past 4 years, the documentation I've been gathering, it's all going to result in legislation that will be known as the Osei Act. Amara Osei from a Manhattan mansion into the national spotlight in a way that would make her one of the most influential voices in American healthcare policy. The call was from 60 Minutes, and they wanted to do a full investigation into her story, her research, and the systematic changes she was proposing. Within hours, her name would be trending on social media, her face would be on the front pages of newspapers, and her voice would be heard in congressional hearings that would reshape an entire industry. As news crews gathered outside and phone calls came in from medical schools wanting to offer her department head positions, from pharmaceutical companies wanting to hire her as a consultant, and from publishers wanting to buy the rights to her story, Dr. Amara Osei stood in the Henderson mansion and felt something she hadn't experienced in 4 long years. The complete absence of the need to make herself smaller, quieter, or more acceptable to anyone. She was exactly who she was supposed to be, and the world was finally ready to see her. Victoria Henderson found herself in the strange position of watching someone she had tormented transform into someone who could have destroyed her family's business with a single phone call, but had chosen instead to focus on saving lives and changing systems. The grace with which Amara had handled her cruelty, the dignity with which she had endured years of humiliation, and the strength with which she was now reclaiming her place in the world, made Victoria realize that she had been in the presence of greatness and had been too blind and cruel to recognize it. Dr. Osei, Victoria said quietly, her voice thick with tears and shame. I know I have no right to ask this, and I know nothing I say can undo what I've done. But is there anything I can do to make this right? Amara looked at her for a long moment, and Victoria saw something in her eyes that she didn't deserve but was receiving anyway. Compassion. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but the recognition that even people who behave terribly are still human beings capable of change. Mrs. Henderson, Amara said gently, the best thing you can do is remember how you felt when you realized you were wrong about me, and use that feeling to treat every person you meet with the dignity and respect that every human being deserves, regardless of what they look like or where they come from, or what job they're doing. Because everyone has a story, everyone has struggles you can't see, and everyone deserves to be treated like the complex, valuable human being they are. Amara Osei walked out of the Henderson mansion for the last time. She was no longer the invisible woman who had entered through the service door that morning. She was walking toward a future where her voice would be heard in the highest halls of power, where her research would save countless lives, and where her story would inspire people around the world to look beyond the surface and see the extraordinary potential that exists in every human being. The transformation was complete, but it had never really been about her changing. It had been about the world finally being ready to see who she had always been. Dr. Amara Osei had never stopped being brilliant, compassionate, and powerful. She had simply been temporarily invisible to people who had forgotten how to see beyond their own prejudices and limitations. Richard Henderson stood in his mansion that evening, watching news coverage of his pharmaceutical company's stock price plummeting as analysts tried to assess the potential impact of Dr. Osei's revelations. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about money or business or maintaining his position in society. He was thinking about a woman who had given up everything for love, who had endured years of humiliation with grace, and who had ultimately chosen to use her power not for revenge, but for healing. Victoria Henderson found herself unable to sleep that night, replaying every cruel word she had ever spoken to Amara, every dismissive gesture, every moment of casual cruelty that had been so easy when she thought her target was powerless to fight back. But the woman who haunted her dreams wasn't the powerful Dr. Osei who had walked out of her house that afternoon. It was the quiet, dignified woman who had cleaned her toilets and endured her insults and never once responded with anything but professional courtesy, even when that courtesy was met with racism and contempt. The mayor's wife, Margaret Chen, spent the evening writing what would become a Pulitzer Prize-winning series of articles about pharmaceutical pricing, immigrant contributions to American medicine, and the hidden costs of prejudice in American society. But the story that stayed with her, the one that would define her writing for years to come, wasn't about corporate corruption or political reform. It was about the quiet courage of a woman who had sacrificed everything for love and had somehow managed to maintain her humanity even when surrounded by people who had forgotten theirs. Dr. Elena Martinez received a call that evening from Dr. Amara Osei, who apologized for the dramatic way her decision to return to medicine had been announced, but confirmed that she was ready to begin her new position as chief resident in neurosurgery the following Monday. Amara, Dr. Martinez said, her voice filled with emotion, "I've been waiting 4 years for this phone call. Welcome home." "Mama," Amara said in Twi, her voice finally free of the careful control she had maintained for 4 years. "I'm coming home soon. And when I do, I'm bringing something with me that's going to change everything for our people. I'm bringing hope." Everyone who heard the story recognized something in it. The times they had been underestimated, the times they had underestimated others, the moments when the masks we all wear slip away and we see each other clearly for the first time. Within a month, Dr. Amara Osei's congressional testimony had launched the most comprehensive pharmaceutical reform legislation in American history. Within 6 months, her research had been credited with making life-saving medications accessible to millions of people who had previously been priced out of survival. Within a year, medical schools across the country were competing to establish the Osei Fellowships, programs designed to support brilliant students from underrepresented communities who might otherwise be lost to medicine because of economic circumstances. But for Dr. Amara Osei herself, the most meaningful change was simpler and more personal. She never had to make herself invisible again. She never had to pretend to be less than she was. She never had to endure cruelty in silence or swallow her dignity to survive another day. She had reclaimed not just her career or her voice, but her fundamental right to exist in the world as exactly who she was. A brilliant, compassionate, powerful woman who had saved her mother's life and was now working to save countless others. The Henderson family eventually lost their pharmaceutical business as investigations revealed decades of pricing manipulation and regulatory capture. Richard Henderson found himself testifying before Congress about practices he had never questioned when they were profitable, but could no longer defend when confronted with their human cost. Victoria Henderson entered therapy and eventually became an advocate for immigrant rights, spending the rest of her life trying to atone for the cruelty she had once worn like a badge of honor. Margaret Chen won the Pulitzer Prize for her series on pharmaceutical corruption, but she always said that the real prize was witnessing Dr. Amara Osei's transformation from invisible to influential, from powerless to powerful, from victim to victor. I learned that day that the most important stories aren't about the people who seem important, she wrote in her acceptance speech. They're about the people who seem invisible, but who are actually carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders with more grace than the rest of us can imagine. Osei's example launched a program to identify and support immigrants whose professional credentials weren't recognized in the United States, helping hundreds of doctors, engineers, teachers, and other professionals reclaim careers that had been lost to bureaucracy and discrimination. Dr. Osei showed us that talent and brilliance exist everywhere, he said at the program's launch. But too often we're too blind to see it, too prejudiced to recognize it, and too cruel to nurture it. Elena Martinez often reflected on the 4 years she had spent trying to convince her former resident to return to medicine, never knowing that Amara had been planning her return all along, never understanding the depth of sacrifice and planning that had gone into those seemingly lost years. She was never really gone, Dr. Martinez told medical students during her lectures about Dr. Osei's case. She was always Dr. Amara Osei. We just weren't looking hard enough to see her. She treated every job with the same attention to detail, the same professionalism, the same dignity, Mrs. Rodriguez said. Now I understand why. Once you're a doctor, you're always a doctor, even when the world can't see it. Here was proof that their children could succeed anywhere in the world, that their intelligence and determination were equal to anyone's, and that the girl who had left years ago to study medicine in America had never forgotten where she came from or who she was fighting for. She carried all of us with her, said the village elder, and now she's carrying all of us forward. The scholarship covered not just tuition, but also living expenses and family support, recognizing that brilliance often comes wrapped in circumstances that make it difficult to pursue traditional paths to success. Harvard Medical School, where Dr. Osei had conducted her pharmaceutical research, launched an investigation into how her contributions had been systematically minimized and attributed to other researchers. The investigation revealed patterns of discrimination that led to comprehensive reforms in how research credit was assigned and how international students and researchers were supported and recognized for their work. Mount Sinai Hospital, where Dr. Osei had returned to practice, found itself at the center of a revolution in neurosurgery as her innovative techniques and research applications began saving lives in ways that had previously been impossible. But beyond her medical contributions, she brought something else to the hospital, a deep understanding of what it meant to be invisible, to be underestimated, and to be treated as less than human, which made her uniquely qualified to advocate for patients who might otherwise be overlooked or dismissed. The pharmaceutical industry itself began to change as the Osei Act worked its way through Congress, with companies scrambling to demonstrate that they were committed to ethical pricing and accessible healthcare rather than simply maximizing profits at the expense of human lives. Dr. Osei's research had exposed not just Henderson Industries, but an entire system of artificial scarcity and price manipulation that had been hiding in plain sight for decades, protected by the assumption that poor people and people from developing countries had no voice and no power to challenge corporate decisions. But what made Dr. Amara Osei's story particularly powerful was not just her professional success or her policy impact, but the way she had maintained her humanity throughout years of systematic dehumanization. She had been treated as invisible, dismissed as ignorant, and subjected to casual cruelty on a daily basis. Yet she had never allowed that treatment to make her cruel in return. Instead, she had used every moment of humiliation as fuel for a larger purpose, documenting every injustice not for revenge, but for justice, gathering evidence not to destroy individual people, but to transform entire systems. The ripple effects of that Tuesday morning in the Henderson mansion continued to spread in ways that no one could have predicted. Medical schools across the country began examining their own practices, wondering how many brilliant minds they had overlooked because of accent, appearance, or economic circumstances. Hospitals started implementing bias training programs and creating pathways for international medical graduates to transition back into practice more easily. Research institutions began reviewing decades of published papers to ensure that contributions from underrepresented researchers were properly credited and recognized. Victoria Henderson's transformation became almost as remarkable as Dr. Osei's revelation. The woman who had spent years finding pleasure in the pain of others discovered that her cruelty had been a symptom of her own emptiness, her own desperate need to feel superior to someone because she had never developed any sense of intrinsic worth. She began volunteering at immigrant service organizations, not to assuage her guilt, but because she had finally understood that everyone carries invisible struggles and deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their circumstances. "I spent my whole life looking down on people," Victoria told a reporter months later, "because I was afraid that if I looked at them clearly, I might see that they were better human beings than I was. And I was right to be afraid, because that's exactly what I saw when I finally opened my eyes. Dr. Osei showed me that strength isn't about having power over other people. It's about maintaining your humanity even when other people try to take it away from you." Osei's story hired her as their chief medical officer and made her approach to ethical pharmaceutical development the cornerstone of their business model. "We learned that you can't build lasting success on the suffering of others," Richard told shareholders during his final meeting as CEO of Henderson Industries. "Dr. Osei showed us that there's a better way to do business, a way that creates value by creating healing rather than by creating scarcity. We're not just changing our company, we're changing our understanding of what business should be for. I learned that the biggest stories aren't always about the people who seem powerful," she said during her acceptance speech. "Sometimes they're about the people who seem powerless but who are actually carrying the power to change everything. If only we're wise enough to see them and brave enough to listen." Elena Martinez watched her former resident transform from a brilliant student to a national figure, to a global leader in medical ethics and pharmaceutical reform. But what impressed her most was how success had never changed Dr. Osei's fundamental character. She's still the same person who would stay up all night researching a patient's condition, who would fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves, who would sacrifice anything for the people she loves. "Doctor," Martinez observed, "success didn't make her different, it just made her visible." Rodriguez began asking all her employees about their backgrounds and qualifications, discovering that her cleaning staff included 2 engineers, a teacher, a nurse, and an accountant, all of whom had been unable to practice their professions in America due to credential recognition issues or economic circumstances. "Dr. Osei taught us that we never know who we're working alongside," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "The person mopping floors next to you might be the person who could save your life if they were given the chance. We have to see each other more clearly, treat each other more kindly, and create more opportunities for people to be who they really are." Osei's mother was recovering became a pilgrimage site for medical students and healthcare advocates from around the world. People who wanted to understand the roots of the strength and compassion that had enabled Dr. Osei to endure years of humiliation without losing her humanity or her hope. Her mother, now fully recovered and walking without assistance, became an inadvertent symbol of what love could accomplish when combined with determination and sacrifice. "My daughter never stopped being a doctor," her mother told visitors in Twy, her words translated by local students who had been inspired by Dr. Osei's story to pursue medical careers themselves. "Even when she was cleaning houses, she was still healing people. She was healing me from thousands of miles away, and she was healing herself by refusing to let their cruelty make her cruel. That is what doctors do. We heal." Osei testified became required viewing in medical schools and business programs across the country, not just because of the policy implications, but because of the moral clarity she brought to complex questions about healthcare, equity, and human dignity. Her testimony lasted for 6 hours, but the moment that was replayed most often was when a senator asked her how she had maintained her composure and her commitment to helping others during the years when she was being systematically dehumanized. "Senator," she replied, "when you know that someone's life depends on your strength, you find strength you didn't know you had. My mother was dying, and that meant I didn't have the luxury of anger or despair or giving up. I had to be stronger than their cruelty, more persistent than their dismissal, and more committed to healing than they were to hurting. Love is the most powerful force in the universe, but it requires us to be worthy of the people who depend on our love." The legislation included provisions for compassionate use programs, requirements for transparent pricing, penalties for artificial scarcity creation, and pathways for generic competition that would save American consumers billions of dollars annually, while ensuring that life-saving medications were accessible to people, regardless of their economic circumstances. But beyond the policy implications, Dr. Osei's story had touched something fundamental about the American dream and the immigrant experience. Here was a woman who had come to America with brilliant qualifications and enormous potential, who had been systematically overlooked and undervalued by institutions that should have recognized her talent, who had been forced to abandon her calling, to survive in a country that claimed to value merit, but often only valued people who looked and sounded like the people who were already in power. Yet she had not only survived, but had ultimately transformed the very systems that had failed her. She had turned years of invisibility into a platform for visibility, years of powerlessness into a foundation for influence, and years of humiliation into a source of moral authority that no one could question or dismiss. She had proven that the American dream was still possible, but only for people strong enough to endure its cruelties and brilliant enough to transform its failures. The medical students who flocked to her lectures came not just to learn surgical techniques, but to understand how someone could maintain their humanity under inhuman conditions, how someone could endure years of systematic discrimination without becoming bitter or angry, and how someone could transform personal pain into universal healing. Dr. Osei's approach to medicine was revolutionary, not because of new technologies or techniques, but because of her deep understanding of what it meant to be vulnerable and powerless in a system designed to overlook and dismiss certain kinds of people. "Every patient I treat," she told her students, "reminds me of myself during those 4 years when I was invisible to the medical establishment. They might not have medical degrees, but they all have stories, they all have struggles, and they all deserve to be seen clearly and treated with dignity." Medicine isn't just about fixing bodies. It's about healing the damage that society inflicts on people who are different or poor or foreign or female or any other category that makes them easy to dismiss. Osei's approach began producing unprecedented results in patient outcomes and satisfaction. Her techniques were revolutionary, not because they were technically complex, but because they were holistically compassionate, taking into account not just the medical condition, but the social, economic, and cultural factors that affected healing. Patients who had been written off by other doctors began recovering under her care, not because she was a miracle worker, but because she was willing to see and treat the whole person, rather than just the disease. Medical schools in Ghana and across Africa began receiving unprecedented applications from students inspired by Dr. Osei's example. Young people who now believed that their dreams of becoming doctors were not just fantasies, but achievable goals that could lead to global impact. The Dr. Amara Osei Foundation, established with proceeds from her book deal and speaking fees, began providing scholarships and support for medical students from underrepresented communities around the world. "She showed us that it's possible," said Kwame Asante, a medical student in Accra who had been inspired by Dr. Osei's story to pursue neurosurgery. Not just possible to succeed in America or Europe, but possible to succeed while staying true to who you are, to your values, to your commitment to your people and your community. She proved that you don't have to choose between success and integrity. Victoria Henderson had donated the property to be converted into a medical clinic and research center focused on neglected tropical diseases, with Dr. Osei serving as the director emeritus. The same rooms where she had been humiliated and dismissed now house laboratories where brilliant researchers from around the world worked on treatments for diseases that primarily affected poor people in developing countries. It seems appropriate, Dr. Osei said during the clinic's opening ceremony, that a place where I was made to feel worthless because of where I came from should become a place dedicated to saving lives in communities like the one where I was born. It's not about revenge or irony. It's about transformation. Places can change just like people can change when we commit to seeing them clearly and working to make them better. Every time she told the story, every time she was interviewed or spoke at conferences, she emphasized that her experience was not unique, that there were countless brilliant, capable, extraordinary people being overlooked and undervalued every day because they didn't fit someone else's narrow definition of what talent and intelligence looked like. I was lucky, she always said. I was lucky that Margaret Chen was there to witness what happened. Lucky that I had documented everything. Lucky that the timing was right for the country to be ready to hear this story. But there are thousands of people with similar stories who aren't lucky, who are still cleaning offices and driving taxis and working in kitchens, despite having qualifications and talents that could change the world, if anyone bothered to see them clearly. Employers in industries from healthcare to education to engineering began implementing blind review processes to identify talent regardless of name, accent, or appearance. Congressional representatives used her testimony as the foundation for comprehensive immigration reform that would make it easier for qualified professionals to practice their trades in America. But perhaps the most profound impact was on individuals who heard her story and began questioning their own assumptions about the people around them. How many times had they dismissed someone because of how they looked or sounded? How many opportunities had they missed because they couldn't see past their own prejudices? How many extraordinary people had they encountered without recognizing their extraordinariness? Victoria Henderson's personal transformation became a case study in rehabilitation and redemption programs, proof that even people who had spent years being systematically cruel could change when confronted with the full humanity of the people they had dehumanized. She began speaking at diversity and inclusion conferences, not as an expert but as a cautionary tale, sharing her story as a warning about how easy it was to become someone you never intended to be when you stopped seeing other people as fully human. I want people to understand that I wasn't born cruel, she told audiences. I became cruel gradually, by making small compromises with my conscience, by accepting casual racism as normal, by finding my worth in making other people feel worthless. Dr. Osei saved me from becoming someone I couldn't live with by showing me who I had already become. That's a gift I can never repay, but I can honor it by making sure other people don't make the same mistakes I made. The new Henderson Medical Foundation focused on developing treatments for diseases that affected primarily poor populations, using innovative funding models that made medications accessible regardless of patients' ability to pay. Dr. Osei taught us that business success built on human suffering is not really success at all, Richard said during a Harvard Business School case study interview. It's just organized cruelty disguised as capitalism. Real success comes from creating value by solving problems and healing suffering, not by creating artificial scarcity and pricing people out of survival. Margaret Chen's Pulitzer Prize opened doors for her to investigate similar stories of hidden talent and systematic overlooking, leading to a series of articles that identified and celebrated extraordinary people who had been working in plain sight while being systematically invisible to the institutions that should have recognized their potential. Her work led to policy changes in multiple industries and inspired countless individuals to look more carefully at the people around them. Dr. Osei's story taught me that the most important journalism isn't about exposing scandals or revealing secrets, Margaret reflected. It's about making visible the people and stories that have been hiding in plain sight, about challenging our assumptions about who matters and who doesn't, about forcing society to see itself more clearly and honestly. The protocol included mentorship programs, financial support, bias training for faculty, and pathways for international medical graduates to transition into American practice. Amara showed us that talent and brilliance exist everywhere, Dr. Martinez explained to medical education conferences. But our systems are often designed in ways that make certain kinds of talent invisible. The Osei Protocol isn't about lowering standards or creating special categories. It's about removing the barriers that prevent us from seeing and nurturing the excellence that's already there. Amara Osei Medical Center, built with funds from her foundation and international donations, became a model for rural healthcare delivery and a training center for medical students from around the world. "My daughter's success belongs to all of us," her mother said during the medical center's opening ceremony. Speaking to an audience that included medical students, government officials, and international healthcare advocates, she carried our hopes with her to America, and now she's bringing American resources back to help our people. This is what success should look like, not forgetting where you came from, but using where you've been to help where you're going. Rodriguez implemented programs to help employees with professional backgrounds transition back into their fields, partnering with credentialing organizations and professional associations to create pathways for recognition and advancement. Dr. Osei taught us that we have a responsibility to see each other clearly, Mrs. Rodriguez explained to business magazines that featured her company as an example of innovative human resources practices. We can't just employ people, we have to recognize their potential and help them achieve it. That's not just good for them. It's good for all of us because we all benefit when talent is recognized and nurtured rather than overlooked and wasted. It had become a mirror that reflected back America's best and worst impulses, its capacity for both cruelty and compassion, its ability to overlook extraordinary people while claiming to value merit and talent. Dr. Amara Osei's experience had forced the country to confront uncomfortable truths about racism, classism, and the systematic ways that brilliant people were being wasted because they didn't fit narrow definitions of what success and intelligence looked like. But the story also offered hope, proof that transformation was possible both for individuals and for institutions, that cruelty could be overcome by compassion, that prejudice could be challenged by truth, and that love could triumph over hate if people were willing to be brave enough to see each other clearly and act on what they saw. Years later, when Dr. Amara Osei was invited to give the commencement address at Johns Hopkins Medical School, she returned to the themes that had defined her journey from invisible housekeeper to internationally recognized medical leader and policy advocate. Standing before an audience of new doctors who would shape the future of medicine, she challenged them to see beyond the surface, to recognize talent wherever it appeared, and to use their power and privilege to lift up rather than tear down. "You are graduating into a world that desperately needs your skills and your compassion," she told them. "But technical competence alone is not enough. You must also cultivate the ability to see clearly, to recognize the humanity in every person you encounter, and to understand that healing is not just about fixing bodies, but about restoring dignity, hope, and possibility to people who may have forgotten they deserve all three." She ended her speech with the words that had become her signature, words that captured the essence of what she had learned during those 4 years when she was invisible, and what she had accomplished in the Eidoponia, years since she had reclaimed her visibility. Remember that everyone you meet is carrying a story you cannot see, struggling with challenges you cannot imagine, and possessing potential you may not recognize. Your job as healers is not just to cure disease, but to see and nurture the extraordinary humanity that exists in every person, regardless of what they look like, where they come from, or what circumstances have brought them to your door. Amara Osei knew that the real measure of her words would not be in the applause, but in how these young doctors treated their patients, their colleagues, and the countless people they would encounter who might be invisible to others, but who deserve to be seen clearly by those with the power to heal, to help, and to transform lives through the simple revolutionary act of recognizing the full humanity in every person they met. And somewhere in the audience, inspired by her words and her example, sat the next generation of healers who would carry forward her legacy of compassion, clarity, and courage, ensuring that the story that began in a Manhattan mansion with an act of cruelty would continue in hospitals and clinics around the world with millions of acts of healing, recognition, and love. The transformation was complete, but the revolution was just beginning. Dr. Amara Osei had not just reclaimed her own visibility and power. She had illuminated a path for countless others who had been rendered invisible by prejudice, overlooked by bias, and undervalued by systems that claimed to reward merit, but often only rewarded conformity to narrow definitions of what talent and worth looked like. Her story would be told and retold, not as entertainment but as education, not as inspiration but as instruction, teaching generation after generation that the most powerful force in the universe was not cruelty or domination, but love expressed through the revolutionary act of seeing each other clearly and treating each other with the dignity that every human being deserved simply by virtue of being human. And in hospitals and clinics around the world, in research laboratories and policy centers, in classrooms and conference rooms, the ripples of that Tuesday morning in the Henderson mansion continued to spread, carried forward by people who had learned that true strength came not from having power over others, but from using whatever power you had to lift others up, to make the invisible visible, and to transform a world that too often overlooked its greatest treasures because they came wrapped in packages that didn't fit society's narrow expectations of what brilliance and beauty and worth were supposed to look like. Dr. Amara Osei had shown them a better way to see, a better way to be, and a better way to heal a world that desperately needed the medicine only love could provide. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more incredible stories of transformation, hope, and the extraordinary power